Hi, my name is Larry Walters, and I'm here today to introduce you to the module from the Leveraging Land-Based Finance training course on developer charges. In this session, we'll talk about what those developer charges, or sometimes called exactions, are. We'll explore their use, and we'll look at a couple of cases. We'll also then give you a chance to have a discussion about those cases in your small groups and in your large group. Okay? Our objectives today are pretty straightforward. We want to understand the use of developer charges to fund infrastructure improvements that are made necessary by the development of vacant land or the redevelopment of existing urban areas. Okay? Now this is a great tool to use because when a developer comes forward and says, we want to this urban extension or we want to redevelop this area, they have a very strong profit motive. They're interested in making money. You have their attention. And in order for them to proceed, they have to have permission from the community. In order to get that permission, if they have to pay a fee, as long as we don't get too greedy, they're quite willing to pay that fee and to share part of those profits as a way of to assure that they get the approvals and the infrastructure they need to support their project. Okay? So let's be clear on what we mean by a developer charge. These are charges that are assessed in connection with the approval of a development. They can be paid in cash, in kind, in land, but they're tied to the approval of a development by someone in the private sector. The charge is assessed once. It may be collected over a period of time if the project is a large project and it unfolds over a period of time. Generally speaking, we collect it up front, and it's collected as the project is approved and completed. Okay. The initial incidence falls on land developers seeking city approval. These are the charges that we're talking about. Let's talk about the different kinds of developer charges that are in common use. The first is what we call an in-kind contribution. These are required improvements that must be constructed at the developer's expense and then transferred to the government. They include water, they include roads, public sidewalks, water distribution, wastewater collection systems, public spaces, other infrastructure within the boundaries of the development. The developer acquires the land, puts in all of the investment required to the standards set by the city, and then when completed, the city inspects it, makes sure it meets their standards, and accepts ownership of those assets. These in-kind contributions also include infrastructure improvements that the developer is required to construct outside the boundaries of the development, such as access roads or intersection improvements. Sometimes, particularly if you put in a large investment, the adjacent road system is not designed to handle the increased traffic. And so you may require the developer to put in better access roads or better intersections, or to do things to offset and to cover the cost of the impact of that development on the broader community. All of these are we call in-kind contribution or in-kind charges. Developer makes the investment and then delivers it to the community. Second type of charge is simply land. This is a proportion of the land the developer is required to transfer to the government, either for public use or sometimes for sale to recover the cost of required public investments. Okay? Third type is simply cash. Cash payments required from the developer to offset the impact of the new project, generally on off-site infrastructure and services. Let's suppose we're going to put in a new subdivision, a new housing complex. Okay? When we do that, the wastewater treatment is collected, is put into the city system, and that new influx of people has now overburdened or overloaded the wastewater treatment facility. The wastewater treatment facility needs to be expanded, rebuilt, refurbished, updated, simply because of that new development. So we may require the developer to provide the cash necessary to put in those improvements. But there are payments required as the development's contribution to the social improvements within the city but they're not necessarily tied directly to the development project. It may also be a matter of social housing. There are communities that have said, okay, if you're going to redevelop this area and take down housing and put in commercial, we want that housing replaced somewhere else in the city, and we want it done. Well, either you pay us the money to do it, or you actually provide the housing. That's also would be considered a development charge. But the purpose is always the same. It's intended to offset the municipal cost associated with new growth. Okay, whether that's increased traffic congestion, needs for better transportation system, whatever the impact is, that's what we're trying to protect the city from. We support new growth. We recognize it has to come. We actually want it because it's good for the community, but we don't necessarily want the private sector to benefit exclusively and put the burden of that growth on the public sector. So what are the minimum requirements in order to make this work? You have to have an appropriate enabling legal framework. You have to be very clear that when a development goes in, it requires the city's approval. It cannot proceed without that approval. And that has to be enforceable as well. In addition, the law has to be clear that the city can identify the costs associated with that improvement and recover those costs from the developer. All of that the potential for that needs to be spelled out in the law. And then you need master plans and detailed plans for the relevant geographic areas. As development comes in, you'll need to understand how that's going to integrate with the surrounding land area and the development of those surrounding areas so that you can anticipate what the overall costs are going to be and how that development is going to impact your community. So you need engineering estimates of the impact of the proposed development on existing infrastructure and the cost of meeting the increased infrastructure needs, whether that be additional road capacity, larger water lines, better storm drainage, whatever the impacts are, you have to anticipate, have the engineering estimates of what those impacts will be and what the cost will be to the city. And then you need to have the administrative capacity to administer the approval of plans. And you have to do that in a timely manner. There is a basic principle among real estate developers, at least I'm told this by my friends who are real estate developers. Time kills all deals. And so you want to make sure that your approval process is not so long that it discourages investment, because that's not our objective. We're not trying to discourage investment, but we are trying to make sure that the community is protected from unanticipated costs. Okay? So we need to be able to administer the plan approval process. We need to process those development applications promptly and accurately. We need to be able to calculate the exaction or the charge that's due, and then we need to be able to monitor compliance. If you've given permission for somebody to build a 9-story building, and that when you turn around they've built a 12-story building, that's a problem. That wasn't in the plan. So you need to be able to monitor their compliance and be able to enforce your decisions. So these developer charges, these one-time fees assessed when the developer seeks approval, whether it be for the development of vacant or agricultural land, or for the redevelopment of existing urban areas. Again, the developers are willing to pay because of the anticipated value of the proposed development. And it's much higher than the cost of the developer charge that you're going to assess. They're going to make money. And all we're asking with using this tool is that they cover all of the costs of that development as well as reaping the benefits. So here's an example. In Medellin, Colombia, they assess each development a fee to be paid in land based on 3 factors: the estimated number of inhabitants, the area of non-residential improvements, and then they have a minimum area that has to be transferred to the city for public purposes. If it makes more sense for the city, because it's not necessarily a very large development, the fee can be paid in cash which is then used to make other infrastructure improvements. For example, if I wanted, or if a developer said, we're going to take this area of existing housing, but it's older, we'd like to redevelop it, increase the density, and therefore the value of the land. We're going to put in a building that's expected to house 350 people. The city would then say, all right, in that zone, because it varies by zone of the city, in that zone, a building that houses 350 people will pay a fee of 1,400 square meters in land plus 10 square meters in land for every 100 square meters of commercial area. The land, or the cash equivalent, is transferred to the city to be used for public spaces and public infrastructure. There are some challenges using this tool. The first is determining how a new development will impact the larger community. As I said, we need to have some engineering estimates of what the impacts are going to be. And those aren't always obvious, and they're not always within the confines of the project itself. It may be that traffic patterns will change, and 2 kilometers away an intersection will break because of this development, okay? Because of the change in the traffic flow. It may be that we see a significant change in the demand for public services. So it's not easy to anticipate all of the implications of those developments, but that's something that we really need to work to do. We also have the challenge of integrating private development proposals with larger community development plans. I can't tell you how many times I've seen well-designed, beautiful master plans saying this is how our community is going to grow over time, and then a developer comes to town and says, no, this piece of land which you have designated for land use X, I want to change it to a higher density, to a commercial use, to a mixed use. I want to do something different with it, and it's going to be great for the community. Everyone is going to be better off because of it. And oh, by the way, I'm going to get rich too. But that's going to be good for the community, okay? And then the community leaders have to decide, does that change fit with our master plan? How does it affect other elements of the master plan and the planning process we're going through? All of that can be a significant challenge in trying to use this kind of a tool, because it's very difficult to sit across the table from a developer and say, no, you can't do that. It doesn't fit our plan, okay? Hard to do, I know that. Sometimes needs to happen. Sometimes we need to work together with the developer to say, well, this is the problems that we see from your plan in terms of what it's going to do to other neighborhoods in our community. How can we work together to address those issues? And it may be that this is where the developer says, there's enough profit in my proposed development that I can afford to help you out in this other community that's going to be adversely affected by the development. Cooperation is going to be much better if you can bring it about. But anticipating and understanding what the implications are of these developments is the challenge that the community has to confront. So, summary. Developer charges are fees. They're an excellent, outstanding, one-time source of revenue to meet infrastructure expansion. The fee should be linked to the actual costs. In some countries, the courts have been very clear. They have to exactly equal what the estimated costs will be. In some cases, in India I'm thinking, they've said you have to put the investment in that infrastructure before you collect the costs, okay? But this is not a tool that's intended to produce great profit for the community. It really is more of a cost recovery instrument, okay? And it requires a lot of advanced planning and really strong administration. Okay. So we're going to look at 2 cases in this regard. The first is from Medellin, Colombia. Medellin is a city of about 2.4 million people. Density is just over 6,300 people per square kilometer. They have about 5 million internally displaced people in Colombia, and Medellin has more than tripled its population in the past 60 years. Much of that growth has been these internally displaced people. The challenge they have is that many people are living in subnormal housing that has been, if not informal, at least not very high standards. And there's an urgent need for improved infrastructure. They have limited funds for social housing and infrastructure, but there's a strong demand for new development and for redevelopment of older areas. The second case you're going to look at is Vancouver, British Columbia. This is a smaller community, population 600,000. Density is about 5,300 people per square kilometer. It's very diverse. About 50% of the inhabitants in Vancouver speak something other than English as their first language. But they have a very strong planning and land use administration. And the city can specify a maximum density, but they're not allowed to really exceed that density or to charge a fee for allowing developers to exceed that density. Okay? So Vancouver has adopted a dual approach. The first is that there is a required developer charge, a fixed fee per square meter of new construction. The fee varies by location and land use. The revenue has to be spent within that same area. But then there's a second voluntary component, which is known as the negotiated community amenity contribution. And these are, as the name implies, they're negotiated. They are voluntary in the sense that the law does not require it. But developers understand that if they want their development approved, they have to agree to make these voluntary community contributions. And they've been very successful at getting investments in community centers and senior centers and daycare centers and a variety of community amenities that would not have existed, the city could not have afforded, but for these negotiated community amenity contributions. So now as you turn your attention to these small group discussions, I would suggest that you consider the following questions. What were the key tasks and the functions that were needed in order for Medellin and Vancouver to use developer charges to fund new infrastructure? What legal foundation was required? What technical tasks and functions were necessary? What was the impact of the charges on vulnerable groups? What level of popular and political support was required? What could have been done differently to improve the use of these instruments in these two cities? When you think you've identified what made them work or how they worked in Medellin and Vancouver, then come back together in a large group and consider the questions. Now, if we wanted to use developer charges in our own context, what would be required? What legal changes would be necessary, if any? What political changes would be required or support would be necessary? How would we develop, if we don't already have the engineering and the planning capacities necessary, the administrative capacities to make it work? Identify the tasks that necessary in Medellin and Vancouver, and then say, where do those tasks, those capacities, those functions exist in our own context, and what would it take to develop them or improve them if we needed to? With that, enjoy your conversation.